Thank you very much, Andy. And thank you all for being here. And big thanks to David Peng for that smooth as butter transition at the end of that last panel. That was much appreciated, setting the stage well. And a big thanks to our Taiwanese hosts. I will say, there's one thing I was a tiny bit disappointed in this week. It's that we did not get to see Guai Guai. And if you don't... Sorry? There's Guai Guai in the meeting room. Okay, well, if you don't know what that is, come ask me or ask one of our Taiwanese hosts later. There's a fun story behind that snack. So, without any further ado, I'm Blaine Curcio, Senior Advisor at Novaspace, and I will talk to you this afternoon for about 20 minutes on the arc of mainland China's commercial space sector. So again, Blaine Curcio, Chinese name Ke Balong. I work at Novaspace. I have a company in Hong Kong, Orbital Gateway Consulting, largely focused on the Chinese civil and commercial space sector. I author the China Space Monitor on Substack, and you can find me on LinkedIn at the convenient hashtag China Space Guy. So do reach out. Happy to connect afterwards. And so just a quick agenda for what I will be talking about in these 20 short minutes. The early days, so life in Chinese space sector before Document 60, the honeymoon phase of commercial space, trouble in paradise, question mark, and where do we go from here? Also question mark. So the early days, life before Document 60. Just a little bit of context, in 2014, the Chinese government published a document, Document 60, which called for more private investment into launch satellites, etc. And before that, and even to some extent today, to a large extent today, the mainland Chinese space sector is still very hierarchical. You have these large state-owned enterprises, so CASC, China Aerospace Science Technology Corporation, being the largest. You have CASIC, you have China Satellite Networks Limited. These are all controlled by CASAC, central government organization that controls all the SOEs. You have the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which lives in its own universe and in many ways has its own space program. There's a lot to talk about there, not within the 20 minutes. And then in the last 10 or 11 years now, you have this growing stable of commercial companies. And depending on how you define commercial space company, there's anywhere from 400 or 500 companies that are really purely space-focused to many thousands of companies that are doing things like 3D printing of many different things, including rocket fairings, or building various semiconductors, including aerospace-grade semiconductors. But basically, you have this large ecosystem that is still largely state-owned, and then these commercial companies, many as they are, exist at the bottom of the totem pole in this kind of uncertain and rapidly evolving world. And digging a little bit more into what the traditional state-owned apparatus looks like. It's very top-down. It's very almost quota-driven. So you have, for example, a national project. We want to build 30 Beidou satellites. And so then you have the national satellite manufacturers, SAST and CAST typically, that get given the contract to build those satellites. And then within, for example, SAST here, you have dozens and dozens of subsidiaries, and I've highlighted a few of the most interesting ones here. But you have the Shanghai Institute of Electronic and Communications Equipment, the Shanghai Institute of Spacecraft Equipment, radio equipment, and so on. And in a very hierarchical way, they have their numbers. So there's 804th, 812th, 802nd, etc. institutes. And when SAST wins the contract for the Beidou satellites, they then mobilize their subsidiaries and say, we need to deliver 15 Beidou satellites in the next 5 years. So how many reaction wheels do we need? How many thrusters do we need? How many satellite platforms do we need to build? And these companies are designed to meet those quotas and to do so in a timely manner, to do so on schedule, on budget, and not really to do much else. So there's not a lot of, throw some stuff at the wall and see what sticks. There's not a lot of incentive to build out production capacity. It's all quite hierarchical and quite top-down in the way that it's structured. And again, the vast majority of the state-owned part of the space sector functions in this layered, top-down kind of way. And again, with passing of Document 60 in 2014, in the last 11 years, we've seen hundreds, or again, by some definitions, thousands of commercial space companies. And a lot of these commercial space companies, they spun off from entities like the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the CAS. The founding teams come out of CAST, they come out of SAST, they come out of CALT, this alphabet soup of different companies. But this leads to two things. It leads to a lot of tech transfer from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, from CAST, et cetera, to these startups. And it also leads to a certain ecosystem model where, let's say, CAST, the main satellite manufacturer, wants to develop a next generation communication payload, and they recognize that in-house they don't really have the innovative culture, they don't really have the incentive structure. It's going to take them years. And so if I'm a CAST engineer and if I'm feeling kind of frisky, I say I want to develop a next generation communication payload. I can create a spin-off. I can oftentimes get funding from CAST or from some entity related to CAST. I can club that with funding from some provincial or city government. Sometimes it's the province or the city where I went to university. And I can create a startup that can move more quickly and react in a more market-based way. And so, again, you have these clusters that are now developing. Chinese Academy of Sciences, fascinating example where they create their own launch company. They have all these science, technology, satellites that they're launching. And so that launch company basically becomes the de facto launch company of the Chinese Academy of Sciences space program. So, they always say in China, the mountains are high, the emperor is far away. So you have the big central government and the big projects, but then you have these fiefdoms that act semi-independently to one another. And that's pretty interesting, in my biased opinion. Talent transfer. What does this look like? I've alluded a little bit, but there's some interesting anecdotes. So the first one would be the launch cluster in Beijing. And so you see here, it's a somewhat old map. There's now a few more launch companies hanging around. But we see, CALT, the big first academy of CAST, they build many of the Long March rockets. They're headquartered in the southeast of Beijing. And then you have over here an area that's referred to as Huojianjie, Rocket Street, where you have every commercial rocket company in China having a headquarters or at least an R&D center. And so, this is maybe a 30-minute driving distance. And so you have these massive clusters. And yesterday, somebody from, or was it this morning, somebody from TASA mentioned that in Taiwan you have, satellites in the north, rockets in the south. And it's interesting because it's the exact same thing in Beijing. In the southeast, you have the rockets, and in the northwest, not on this map, you have a satellite manufacturing cluster that looks almost exactly the same. So again, this clustering is a big thing. The other interesting thing with talent transfer is, what happens when a senior state-employed rocket scientist wants to take their 10, 20, 30 years of know-how and go work for a commercial launch company. And there was an interesting example back in the day, 2018, I think. Zhang Xiaoping, who was working for a CAST subsidiary in Xi'an, he was allegedly offered 10 times his salary to go move to land space. And this CAST subsidiary was none too happy about that. They sued him, they sued land space, and they tried to stop this, saying, among other things, that it would slow down China's race to reusable rockets, something like that. And the rumor at the time in China, and I don't think you'll find this written down anywhere, is that this decision went all the way up to Xi Jinping, who allegedly said, as long as he stays in China, he can do what he wants. And as we've seen since then, I mean, all speculation aside, that has continued to happen now. You have lots of senior people leaving the state-owned sector and going into commercial companies. You also, interestingly, have senior people within these commercial companies leaving and starting their own commercial companies. And that creates some challenges with things like, do there need to be 50 launch companies in mainland China? And the answer is probably not, but again, 20 minutes, that's another topic for another day. And so the honeymoon phase of commercial space, massive growth from a low starting point. So just a couple of quick numbers. In 2014, 15, and 16 combined, let's see if I can do this, China launched 104 satellites on 56 rockets in those 3 years combined. And then in just August of this year, they launched 52 on 7 rockets. So I guess it doesn't sound nearly as impressive as taking the years individually, but still the point is there's been a lot more launches from mainland over the last handful of years, and that launch cadence is going up. As you see, 2025, we've already pretty well surpassed 2024, and we still have, 55 days, I think Dr. Bhattacharya said earlier. So I would expect that 2025 number to maybe reach 400 in terms of the number of satellites launched. And the other thing we see here is that commercial, and that's a loaded term, so bear with me, but commercial has gone from essentially 0 to almost half of all satellites that have been launched from the mainland over these last few years. And funding has largely followed suit. It's a clunky graph, but you have high and low estimates for funding. As we see, we're looking at something of the order of magnitude of $2.5–3 billion US dollars per year over the last couple of years, and the number of funding rounds is now up towards 100 funding rounds per year for commercial space companies. And there's a lot of interesting idiosyncrasies. I was talking to somebody earlier at lunch. One of the things I see often is new companies have small angel and seed funding rounds that are mostly private VC. As the companies get bigger, as their valuations go up, the private VCs kind of take a step back, and you have provincial and city governments coming in for the bigger funding rounds. And so there's a lot of interesting idiosyncrasies like that, which I'm happy to talk about later if you hunt me down and grab me for a coffee. And we've seen these mega projects start to accelerate. The two biggest ones, well, let's say the one biggest concept being the Chinese version of Starlink. There's two main constellations there. So there's Satnet, or Guowang, which is owned by the central government, and then there's Tianfan, or Thousand Sails, which is a nominally commercial but largely Shanghai government and Chinese Academy of Sciences backed venture. And to cut a long story short, both of these projects incubated for quite a few years, didn't make a whole lot of progress, and then just in the last 24 months or so, they've launched a combined 225 satellites between the two of them, raised a few $1 billion, and there's a lot of jockeying there to see, which of these two constellation projects is going to win out. I could talk for 2 hours about that, but I won't. But in any case, these big projects are starting to accelerate, and among other things, that's creating real demand for some of these commercial companies. So for example, the Long March rocket is fairly reliable. They build a lot of them, but not that many Long Marches per year are able to launch dozens of satellites for a constellation. And so you need commercial rockets to come in and do this. But none of the commercial launch companies have reliably been able to launch a medium or heavy lift rocket yet. And so you have this, earlier this year, Thousand Sails, one of these constellations, they put out 3 or 4 different tenders for launch, and they had to cancel all of them because each tender only received 2 bids from CALT and from SAST, the 2 state-owned launch companies. And in order for it to be a valid tender, you need 3 bids. And all these commercial launch companies are desperate for business, so the fact that they were not able to submit a bid, it speaks to their apparent technological immaturity at this particular point in time. And there's a lot of reading tea leaves there. I don't want to say anything too concrete, but I think that's a fair assumption. Trouble in paradise. So as I alluded to earlier, there's a lack of consolidation, let's say. There's 50 launch companies, and if we look at the 7 largest launch companies on this map here, they have a combined 51 rocket production sites. Now, mind you, these 7 companies and the 51 rocket production sites, they are responsible for maybe 15 rockets this year. And so, if someone can explain to me how you can justify 51 rocket production sites to produce 15 rockets, I'd be very interested to hear that. And this is the same thing as happening in satellite manufacturing, where you'll see a factory get built, you'll see the grand opening, you'll see all of this German-made industrial robots, because KUKA, the German industrial robot company, got bought by a Chinese company quite some years ago, and so all the factories have KUKA. And then the factory builds 6 satellites in a year, and then you never hear from them again. And you think, well, whatever happened to all those robots? AI took their jobs. But in any case, it's a bit of a paradox that you have all this activity, all this support, and not as much output as you might think. There's a whole lot of interesting questions that would be interesting to discuss further. And now we're starting to see, potential oversupply of some things. So there's not enough rockets, but in some cases there's too many laser communication terminals. You have 15 companies, and they're all building hundreds of terminals per year, or they have capabilities, I should say, to build hundreds of terminals per year. You have companies like Lanyue Electromechanical, Lanyue Jidian. They're building, probably 4,000-ish reaction wheels per year by the end of this year. And the same is true in things like solar cells, and the same is true in things like antennas. And so it's this weird, not terribly efficient, very question mark inducing system that you have. And that's inconvenient. Holding you all in suspense. That's still on. Oh. We got something. Can you still, okay, well, the sound is still working. Well, the conclusion doesn't need slides as much, so let's give it 10 more seconds. And, oh, hey. Thank you to the AV team. That was clutch. So where do we go from here? I moved to Shenzhen in 2011. I was 22, and it was a great time to be living in Shenzhen. And back at that time, and I don't live in Shenzhen anymore, I would just say. I left back in 2017. But at that time, 100% of the city's taxis looked like this. So the old Volkswagen Santanas, probably built somewhere in Hebei province in a JV, but gas-powered Volkswagen Santanas. And around 2023, this local company in Shenzhen no one had ever heard of, BYD, they started getting more publicity. And the Shenzhen municipal government at one point said, we want to make our whole city's taxi fleet electric BYDs. And by 2014, 100% of the city's taxis were electric BYDs. And I was in Milan in 2023, it was 40 miles from the headquarters of Fiat, this titan of Italian industry. And I was walking around Piazza del Duomo, and you see all the Gucci, and you see all these other brands that are titans of Italian luxury. And as I walk along the piazza, the biggest shop in the piazza, they almost had to carry me out on a stretcher. It was BYD. And I was this, holy shit. Like, BYD has made it to Italy, and 40 miles from Fiat, you have a company selling Chinese-made electric vehicles to Italians. And so, what does that mean in the context of space? Well, China is not yet building rockets in the same way and the same scale at the same price as they build EVs, but a handful of years ago, they weren't building EVs like they build EVs now either. And so in the space domain, it's going to take time. There's a lot of messiness and there's a lot of inefficiency, but eventually I would expect that we're going to have thousands of satellites being launched from mainland China. We're going to have tens of thousands of laser communication terminals being produced. We're going to have, in some instances, just enormous industrial overcapacity. And that's going to have knock-on effects for a lot of different things in the space sector. So with that all being said, I think, made my time. Thank you very much. 非常感谢. And do we have time for Q&A, or are we just not going to do Q? 2 minutes for Q&A.
Is that they weren't undercutting prices of the Western companies on those bids where you could find out what the customer was buying because they were publicly traded or some other reason. It closely hewed to the prices you could find in the United States, Japan, and Europe. And so you wonder why not? They weren't just undercutting it to keep prices high enough to win the contract, but they could have gone lower. They often lost these contracts because of insurance or other reasons. Do you have enough insight into the pricing of some of these companies? Obviously there's an excess of supply and all over the place there, but are there any benchmarks of deals that have gone down where you can determine what a reaction wheel or a laser intersatellite link system or whatever it is goes for? Are they, the image we have in our heads is cheap Chinese production equals cheap prices, and that's a problem if they're any good. But is that the case?
So anecdotally, not yet. And I would also say there's a significant difference between state-owned enterprises and commercial companies, where if you have, let's say, your, China Satcoms or any of the CASC subsidiaries, not being very purely commercial companies, they don't necessarily have an incentive to really drop their prices in a lot of instances. So like I've heard, for example, when talking to foreign entities that are potentially looking at buying some kind of a component from a cask subsidiary, it's like, yeah, they took 8 weeks to get back to us with anything, and when they came back to us with the price, it was twice as much as what we could get elsewhere, because it's just, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's that kind of system where they build enough reaction wheels within the system to build the Beidou constellation or the whatever, and then they don't have a lot of excess capacity within the system. Now, outside the system, that being SOEs, outside of that, the commercial companies, I mean, it's a bit of a free-for-all in terms of growing the supply. The thing right now, I think, that is preventing oversupply flooding into the global market, well, there's two things. One, the regulations around exporting this kind of stuff is still pretty murky. But then also, two, I've spoken with some commercial companies where they want to export laser terminals, but then they make it to the next round of a tender to supply laser terminals to the big Guowang constellation, and they immediately lose all interest in addressing international markets because they think, well, if we're trying to supply Guowang, we better be pretty damn Chinese, huh? And so, again, it's all kind of TBD still, but if you look at articles that are published by some of these companies, like laser comm terminals companies or remote sensing satellite manufacturers, and you look at the prices that they talk about, it's interesting. I mean, like, just to give one last example, and I know I'm rambling here, so I'll keep it. So CGSTL, they're a Chinese Academy of Sciences spin-off based up in Changchun. They build optical remote sensing satellites. They are sanctioned, so they've got that going for them, for selling data to the Houthis of all people and to the Wagner Group, so, nice friends to have. But they built 3 generations of optical remote sensing satellites. So 2014, they would build a satellite of, X capability, and the satellite would weigh 500 kilograms, and it would cost $30 million US. The second generation would weigh 150 kilograms and cost $12 million US. And the third generation is 40 kilograms and it costs, $2 million US or something like that. Now that's the cost to build, and again, they're sanctioned and they're kind of quasi-state owned, and so they're not the most commercially oriented company right now. But I also speculate that eventually, this whole bubble that we're seeing, where like all these provincial and city governments who don't really have the healthiest finances to begin with, they're throwing all this money at space companies, they're saying, build, build, build. They can't just subsidize that forever and not worry about going into international markets. Like eventually something's gonna have to give there, because the government of Tianjin has no business in subsidizing, 6 rocket factories around the Binhai New area, something like that. So with that all being said, in a foreshadowing for the next session, I say to you, thank you very much, and terima kasih. Now, does anyone? We'll see if the foreshadowing is appreciated there. But Andy, to you.
Thank you, Blaine. Thank you, Blaine, for a wonderful session.